Hello and welcome back to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg. So, earlier this week, I did a video about my most anticipated books that are going to be released in the second half of 2023. I will have a link to that video in the description box down below if you would like to check it out. This is sort of a follow-up to that video because in that research process, I came across a lot of books that turned me into that, thinking face emoji, and I was trying to think, do I want to read this book or not? And last year I had done a video talking about books that I wasn't quite sure I wanted to read, and I just thought I would revisit it and sort of do that again. I'll link last year's video about this topic down below. There are not too many books to cover here, and the reason why I'm a little bit hesitant about all of these books is very different for each. So let's kind of dive in and talk about the first one. I'm going to talk about these in the order in which they are going to be released, starting with the one that is going to be released first and then working our way into the future. And then we'll talk about some books that I am not interested in reading, but which might be of interest to you, and I will mention them and talk about them for your sake, but they are definitely not anything that I'm going to be adding to my own pile of possibilities for 2023 or beyond. The first book will release on July 25th. It is Somebody's Fool by Richard Russo. I'm actually a fan of Richard Russo. So my hesitation from this actually comes from the starred review that this book got from Kirkus. It's a little bit odd that a starred review made me hesitant, but I'm going to read that review to you, and we'll get to the part where that gave me a little bit of a red flag, I'm not sure about this. Here we go. Back to North Bath, New York for a third round of misadventures, tomfoolery, and personal growth. The demise of Donald Sully Sullivan, Russo's beloved main character in Everybody's Fool, is no obstacle to the success of the author's return visit to the benighted North Bath, though at its opening the town is put out of its misery by being officially dissolved, its environs annexed to its bright and shiny neighbor, Schuyler Springs. Despite his death, Sully casts a long shadow over the doings of the remaining population. Peter, his college professor's son, Rub, his old sidekick, Chief of Police Douglas Raymer, his erstwhile nemesis, Ruth, his longtime paramour, all constantly finding themselves recalling his instructions and example. Though the closing of the North Bath Police Department puts Raymer out of a job, when a body is found at the long-shuttered Sans Souci Hotel, he is sent to investigate by his former employee and on-again, off-again girlfriend, the new chief of police of Schuyler Springs, Charisse Bond. Charisse is attractive and black, while middle-aged Raymer looks like, quote, he and the Pillsbury Doughboy might have a common ancestor, end quote. But Charisse's twin brother Jerome is on hand to teach Raymer a few things he needs to know about the Black experience. I'm going to stop right there because that is the sentence that gives me a bit of a warning flag. I love Richard Russo. I question whether or not he is the author that I would go to for a lesson in the Black experience. I don't want to be mean or unduly cruel about it because I think he is a sharp and perceptive writer, but when I think about a Richard Russo novel, I don't think about that sort of content at all. I think about mostly male white experiences in communities like Maine and things like that. So that's the thing that immediately makes me kind of hesitant. The other thing that makes me hesitant before we get into the rest of the review is that I haven't read the second book in the series. So Nobody's Fool is the first, and then Everybody's Fool, the one they mentioned, is the sequel that came out in 2016. And I haven't read that. So I feel like I would need to read the middle book before I would get to this one in the series, if that makes sense. So there are actually two things that are kind of making me hold back on this one. But I feel like that, even though this is a starred review from Kirkus, that component about learning a thing or two about the Black experience, it makes me think, ooh, I kind of want to wait and see how people respond to this book when it is actually published. It's just me. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below. All right, so picking up in other news, a third generation of Sullivan shows up in town, Peter's son Thomas, from whom he has been long estranged. Thomas looks a lot like his brother Will, the only one of the boys Peter raised, now abroad on a Fulbright scholarship as a result of advantages that Thomas and his younger brother lacked and about which they are bitterly resentful. Another three-generation plotline involves the thorny relationships among Ruth, her daughter Janie, and her granddaughter Tina. Bad cops, bigotry, partner violence, nefarious schemes, and confusing therapy sessions aside, almost all of the characters experience significant improvements in their self-concepts, relationships, and circumstances. The king is dead. Long live the king. Russo's version of the good old-fashioned comic novel is the gold standard, full of heart and dexterous storytelling. And I have experienced that because I've also read Empire Falls by Richard Russo and Bridge of Sighs. Bridge of Sighs, I would say, is a flawed book, but it's a well-intentioned book. And I remember when it was released, a lot of people kind of criticized it and didn't like it, and I got a lot out of it. So I love Richard Russo as a storyteller, and he is very good at these sort of class distinctions and writing about economically depressed towns and working men and things like that. It's just that one sentence about teaching Raymer a few things he needs to know about the Black experience immediately like whiplashed me out of my excitement for this book, for better or for worse. It is what it is. And again, let me know what you think of it in the comment section down below, because I know a lot of other people are fans of Richard Russo. The next one is a book that I know a lot of people are excited. And again, this one has a starred review from Kirkus. It's Tom Lake by Ann Patchett, which is going to be released on August 1st of this year. The reason I am hesitant is that I've only read one book by Ann Patchett. A long time ago, I managed to get an advanced reader's copy of her book, Run, before it was released. So that is the only book by her that I have read. And being honest, I hated it. Like, really, I aggressively disliked it. It felt like a book that was probably well-intentioned, but wildly accidentally offensive. It is about, there's a wealthy white family that has adopted a black child, and then the mother of that black child has been sort of keeping tabs on the family, and she has another daughter that she has raised. And the book, again, I think accidentally sort of implies that these kids are better off with the wealthy white family than they are with their own mother. And the way it's handled really didn't sit well with me at all. So I've basically brushed off anything by Ann Patchett that has come out since or that was published before that book, just because I really did not like Run. I'm starting to think I should give her another try. I think another layer of hesitation on Tom Lake is, if I'm going to read an Ann Patchett book, I feel like people talk about Commonwealth the most, and The Dutch House was actually a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. So I would be more likely to start with them. I know a lot of people have been fans of other books by her, like Bel Canto, but I feel like either Commonwealth or The Dutch House are the ones that I would probably pick up first, which means Tom Lake would probably wait. Here's the starred review from Kirkus. It's time to harvest the cherries from their Michigan orchard, but the pandemic means that Joe Nelson, his wife Lara, and their daughters Emily, Maisie, and Nell must pick all the fruit themselves. To lighten the lengthy, grueling workdays and prompted by the recent death of world-famous actor Peter Duke, the girls press Lara to tell them about her romance with Duke at Tom Lake, a summer stock company in Michigan, and her decision to give up acting after one big movie role. Lara's reminiscences, peppered by feisty comments from her daughters and periodic appearances by her gentle, steadfast husband, provide the foundation for Patchett's moving portrait of a woman looking back at a formative period of her life and sharing some, but only some, of it with her children. Duke flashes across her recollections as a wildly talented, nakedly ambitious, and extremely crazy young man clearly headed for stardom, but the real interest in this portion of the novel lies in Patchett's delicate delineation of Lara's dawning realization that, fine as she is as Emily in Our Town, she has a limited talent and lacks the drive that propels Duke and her friend and understudy Pallas. The fact that Pallas, who's black, doesn't get the break that Duke does is one strand in Patchett's intricate and subtle thematic web, which also unfolds the nature of storytelling, the evolving dynamics of a family, and the complex interaction between destiny and choice. Lara's daughters are standouts among the sharply drawn characterizations. Once volatile Emily, now settled down to be the heir apparent to the farm, no-nonsense veterinarian in training Maisie, and Nell, the aspiring actor and unerring observer who anticipates every turn in her mother's tale. Patchett expertly handles her layered plot, embedding one charming revelation and one brutal, but in retrospect inevitable, betrayal into a dual narrative that deftly maintains readers' interest in both the past and present action. These braided strands culminate in a denouement at once deeply sad and tenderly life-affirming, poignant and reflective, cementing Patchett's stature as one of our finest novelists. The other thing I will say before moving on to the next book is that one of the other things that is sort of making me wonder if I should try another Ann Patchett book is that she has a bookstore, an independent bookstore in Tennessee called Parnassus. And I love what she does for independent bookstores. And she has a really charming presence on their social media accounts. She frequently does videos where she talks about if you haven't read it, then it's new to you, and she tries to introduce you to other books that she has liked or that have inspired her writing or anything like that. And she just has this really charming, sweet presence. And again, I love what she does for independent bookstores and for the book community and the publishing community. So I think that is making me soften on how much I disliked Run and think that I should give her the benefit of the doubt and read another one of her books. And if you have thoughts about that, let me know in the comment section down below. That takes us to a book called Sun House by David James Duncan, who wrote a book called The Brothers K that I've heard a lot of good things about but have not read. This got another starred review in Kirkus, but part of my concern is the length. It's 800 pages, and that feels like a lot. And I'm not opposed to a long book, but let's do the review, and then we'll kind of talk about it. Jim Harrison meets Robert M. Persig, Timothy Leary, and the Dalai Lama in Duncan's long-awaited follow-up to The River Y and The Brothers K. The River Y was published in 1983, and The Brothers K was published in 1992, so it has indeed been a long time. And that combination of authors does turn me into that kind of thoughtful face emoji again. That's like the first place I start questioning a little bit. Here we go. An inch-long steel bolt separates from an airplane and falls to Earth, where it embeds itself in the skull of an 8-year-old girl hoeing weeds with her widower father in a Mexican cornfield, killing her almost instantly. So improbable is this occurrence that it has to be more than chance, an assassination on the part of some jealous or malicious god. So thinks a fallen Jesuit, one of several characters in Duncan's vast novel who suffer a crisis of faith, and who fall into each other's orbit in a breathtakingly beautiful Montana valley that's full of heartbreaking possibilities. I live in Montana, so that part does grab my attention. The first major player we meet is a footloose actor whose mother died on his 5th birthday, a source of psyche-snapping grief for the rest of his life. In time, he falls in with another wounded bird, a Sanskrit student who has impossibly learned courtesy of her similarly brilliant, if emotionally unavailable father, who, for reasons that unfold over hundreds of pages, turns out to be the reason Montana figures in the story at all. Duncan's characters suffer pain, loss, death, and all the makings of Buddhist samsara that fuel our Sanskritists' weary mistrust of the world. Though of Michener length, James Michener famously wrote long novels, the story is talky and without much action. Duncan writes page after page to describe even the smallest incidents, as with his long and quite shattering disquisition on the death of a beloved dog. You can probably guess that is where I really snap out of this review and think, oh, I don't know about that. Yet that talk, arch and bookish, Gary Snyder makes a cameo appearance, will prove captivating to those who enjoy novels of ideas. In this case, one that modernizes the Western by injecting it with ethnic diversity and doses of philosophy, and LSD even. For all its excesses, a book by a first-rate writer and one to be savored. So the reason the length seems like a bit of a concern to me, because I'm not opposed to a long book, is when it talks about it being very talky and without much action, it feels like 800 pages is a lot to sustain that. Clearly, Kirkus thinks that it does. And it's interesting as well because it reminds me a little bit of the Thornton Wilder novel, The Bridge of San Luis Rey, the book that he won a Pulitzer Prize for. Because that book deals with a sort of random act of chance that kills 5 people, a bridge collapses, and someone investigates to try to find out, was this an act of God? Was it punishment? Like, had they done something wrong in their life that meant that they were doomed to punishment? And this book feels like a really long, because The Bridge of San Luis Rey is not a long book. It's a novella, I believe. I'm pretty sure it's under 200 pages, but don't quote me on that. And this is much longer and clearly coming from a more Buddhist perspective, which is a sort of interesting twist, but I don't know. I just don't know. And then when it talks about the death of a beloved dog, I lost a dog a year ago, and I don't think I could read a long and quite shattering disquisition on the death of a beloved dog. I think I'm a long way off from being able to read anything like that. It sounds really interesting, but there are things about it that make me think, not right now. And, that is what it is. You kind of need to work your way through those things before you can really force yourself to jump in. Then we have The Fraud by Zadie Smith. This is going to be released on September 5th, and I have only read one book by Zadie Smith, so I feel like I should try another one of her books. I don't know that this would be the one, and that's where my hesitation on this comes in. I've read On Beauty, and I read On Beauty because it is a sort of modernized version of Howard's End, and I didn't think it was anywhere near as successful as Howard's End, but I know a lot of people are a fan of that book. But because I was so muted on my response to that book, I've sort of not felt like picking up another Zadie Smith book. If I were going to pick one up, I think I would probably go with White Teeth, which, if it was not her debut, was one of her first books, and try that because I've heard a lot of really good things about it over the years. Here is the description of The Fraud on bookshop.org. It is 1873. Mrs. Eliza Touchet is the Scottish housekeeper and cousin by marriage of a once famous novelist, now in decline, William Ainsworth, with whom she has lived for 30 years. Mrs. Touchet is a woman of many interests: literature, justice, abolitionism, class, her cousin, his wives, this life, and the next. But she is also skeptical. She suspects her cousin of having no talent, his successful friend, Mr. Charles Dickens, of being a bully and a moralist, and England of being a land of facades, in which nothing is quite what it seems. Andrew Bogle, meanwhile, grew up enslaved on the Hope Plantation, Jamaica. He knows every lump of sugar comes at a human cost, that the rich deceive the poor, and that people are more easily manipulated than they realize. When Bogle finds himself in London, star witness in a celebrated case of imposture, he knows his future depends on telling the right story. The Tichborne trial, wherein a lower-class butcher from Australia claimed he was in fact the rightful heir of a sizable estate and title, captivates Mrs. Touchet and all of England. Is Sir Roger Tichborne really who he says he is, or is he a fraud? Mrs. Touchet is a woman of the world, Mr. Bogle is no fool. But in a world of hypocrisy and self-deception, deciding what is real proves a complicated task. Based on real historical events, The Fraud is a dazzling novel about truth and fiction, Jamaica and Britain, fraudulence and authenticity, and the mystery of other people. It actually does sound really interesting, but so did On Beauty. And I can't even say I've been burned in the past, because it's not that On Beauty is a bad book. I just didn't think it measured up to Howard's End, which is a really tall order. Howard's End is a great book. But I don't want to get my hopes up about this one, because I really had gotten my hopes up about On Beauty when it was published, and I ended up being very muted on it. And I do still wonder if I should go back and read White Teeth first. So if you have thoughts about Zadie Smith, where I should go next, because I would like to read another book of hers. I just don't know that this would be the next place to go. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. Then we get to Evil Eye by Etaf Rum. This is going to be released on September 5th. And I'm going to do the review from Kirkus, even though it is not a starred review. I read A Woman Is No Man for the BookTube Prize, actually. And I remember liking it, but I don't remember much of anything about it. And that's where my hesitation on this comes from. Because it's like, well, I really like that book, but I also have almost no memory of it at all. So that's where the main hesitation for this comes from. Here's the review from Kirkus. Typical contemporary fiction about a woman's journey toward self-knowledge and identity is enriched by the protagonist's particular situation as the resentfully obedient daughter of Palestinian immigrants. On the first page, Yara, a wife and mother approaching 30, announces her intention, and by extension author Rum's, to reconcile past and present. Raised in Brooklyn within a tight Palestinian expatriate community, Yara has always been torn, wanting to honor the history and hardships of her ancestors while resisting many of her culture's prescriptions, agreeing to an arranged marriage but refusing hijab. For 10 years, she has lived in North Carolina with her husband Fadi and their 2 daughters. Along the way, she has earned a master's degree and works at a local college. But as her life begins falling apart, she can no longer avoid the unresolved conflict she has always felt, the safety of obedience versus an inner urge to break free and claim control over her life. Yara's central conflict revolves around her mother, a deeply troubled woman who, despite all-consuming anger and frustration, never considered leaving her abusive marriage. She always considered herself cursed and told Yara she was cursed too. At a therapist's suggestion, Yara begins a journal to confront her past, but the repetitiveness of Yara's memories and her use of therapeutic jargon weaken the impact. More compelling are Yara's struggles within her own marriage. While Fadi is deeply flawed, he is neither stereotype nor villain. And Rum does not simplify the choices Yara faces as a woman whose ambition conflicts with family responsibility. The couple shares a surprising degree of intimacy, showering together most nights, and similar unhappy childhood memories. Whether Yara can break the vicious cycle in which she finds herself is the question. Rum's nuanced approach to difficult questions of individual and cultural identity is refreshing. I mean, everything about that sounds interesting and like something I would want to read. My only real concern is that I felt the same way about A Woman Is No Man, and I don't remember anything about the book. And the fact that it has faded so almost completely from my memory makes me a little hesitant. That's probably unfair. I freely admit that. And I feel like this is a book that I could very easily be persuaded to read as a result. But because the first book had faded from my memory so much, I feel like I'm not going to commit to reading it or seek it out or anything like that until I see a little more about the reception to it once it is actually published. Then we get to Northwoods by Daniel Mason, which will be published on September 19th. Daniel Mason was a Pulitzer Prize finalist for a book called A Registry of My Passage Upon the Earth, something like that. I may have gotten it a little bit wrong. It doesn't actually say that book on this description, so please forgive me if I got it wrong. But yes, so I feel like in this case, if I'm going to pick up one of his books, I'm going to go for Registry of My Passage Upon the Earth. But this does sound interesting. It also sounds a little complicated. Let's do the description and then maybe you'll see what I mean. When 2 young lovers abscond from a Puritan colony, little do they know that their humble cabin in the woods will become the home of an extraordinary succession of human and non-human characters alike. An English soldier destined for glory abandons the battlefields of the New World to devote himself to growing apples. A pair of spinster twins navigate war and famine, envy and desire. A crime reporter unearths an ancient mass grave, only to discover that the earth refuses to give up their secrets. A lovelorn painter, a sinister conman, a stalking panther, a lusty beetle. As the inhabitants confront the wonder and mystery around them, they begin to realize that the dark, raucous, beautiful past is very much alive. This magisterial and highly inventive novel from Pulitzer Prize finalist Daniel Mason brims with love and madness, humor and hope. Following the cycles of history, nature, and even language, Northwoods shows the myriad magical ways in which we're connected to our environment, to history, and to one another. It is not just an unforgettable novel about secrets and destinies, but a way of looking at the world that asks the timeless question, how do we live on even after we're gone? That is an interesting question. I think the structure of this novel sounds interesting, although tricky. It kind of reminds me of Homegoing by Yaa Gyasi, which moves forward a generation, so you don't really have a through-line character. I don't know if that's going to be the case in this book, but it certainly sounds like it's more about the place, the home, than it is necessarily about following a single story. It's more about the variation of the stories and how people impact the people who come after them, which is really interesting. But I feel like because it's complicated, or has potential to be complicated, to be fair, I might want to wait, read A Registry of My Passage Upon the Earth, and see where I go from there. And maybe if this book has a big reaction when it's published. There isn't really much of a review presence for this book online, which is a little surprising given that it's coming in September. but I feel like I'm just going to be interested until I hear a little bit more or I read one of Daniel Mason's other books and it sparks my interest more concretely. This is another book that I could very easily be convinced to move to my most anticipated list. But here we are. That takes us to The Hive and the Honey, Stories by Paul Yoon. This is on this list because of another book that I read by Paul Yoon. It's very similar to Etaf Rum. I read The Mountain, which is another collection of short stories, and it didn't stick with me at all. I don't remember much of anything about it. I do remember that I think part of the dissonance I have with that book was that I really didn't like the audio production of it. It felt like a story would end and another would start, and they didn't have very clear delineation of when a story ended and when one began. So it just kind of felt like, wait a minute. It was very confusing to listen to. I'm sure that's part of it, and it's not Paul Yoon's fault necessarily. But because that book has faded so spectacularly from my memory, I'm a little hesitant. And this does sound kind of quirky. Here's the description. A boy searches for his father, a prison guard on Sakhalin Island. In Barcelona, a woman is tasked with spying on a prizefighter who may or may not be her estranged son. A samurai escorts an orphan to his countrymen in the Edos period. A formerly incarcerated man starts a new life in a small town in upstate New York and attempts to build a family. The Hive and the Honey is a bold and indelible collection by celebrated author Paul Yoon, one that portrays the vastness and complexity of diasporic communities, with each story bringing to light the knotty inheritances of their characters. How does a North Korean defector connect with the child she once left behind? What are the traumas that haunt a Korean settlement in Far East Russia? Lauded as a quotidian surreal craftmaster by New York Magazine, Yoon's stunning stories are laced with beauty and cruelty, and The Hive and the Honey is the work of an author writing at the very height of his powers. This is another one that doesn't have much review presence right now, and I think that's the thing that would convince me to maybe give this one a try. It comes out on October 10th, by the way. I don't think I mentioned that. I'm not opposed to it. I am curious to read another book by Paul Yoon. I don't know that this would be the one, and I'm not sure how committed to that I am, being honest. That takes us to the books that are not for me, but notable. And my intention here is not to be mean-spirited at all. These are books that I think people would be right to be interested in, if that's your thing. For whatever reason or one reason or another, there are only 3 of these. I am just not personally going to pick them up, but I think it's worth putting information about there for other people, because for the first one in particular, I think people will be very excited to hear that there's something new by this author, and that is The Sting by Paul Murray. The reason I think a lot of people will be excited about this is that Paul Murray wrote the book Skippy Dies, and that is sort of a cult favorite among a subset of BookTube. And for that reason, I feel like a lot of people will be interested in this. I read Skippy Dies and I thought it was fine, but I did not get into it anywhere near as much as other people did. And for that reason, I don't feel excited about a new Paul Murray book myself, but I feel like a lot of other people will be. So again, it's not to be mean-spirited. It's just that, I'm not as excited about this one, but I feel like other people will be happy to know that it is coming. So this is going to be published on August 15th. Here is the short description of it. From the author of Skippy Dies comes Paul Murray's The Bee Sting, an irresistibly funny, wise, and thought-provoking tour de force about family, fortune, and the struggle to be a good person when the world is falling apart. The Barnes family is in trouble. Dickie's once lucrative car business is going under, but rather than face the music, he's spending his days in the woods building an apocalypse-proof bunker with a renegade handyman. His wife Imelda is selling off her jewelry on eBay, while their teenage daughter Cass, formerly top of her class, seems determined to binge drink her way through her final exams, and 12-year-old PJ is putting the final touches to his grand plan to run away from home. Where did it all go wrong? A patch of ice on the tarmac, a casual favor to a charming stranger, a bee caught beneath a bridal veil. Can a single moment of bad luck change the direction of a life? And if the story has already been written, is there still time to find a happy ending? Again, the story doesn't sound bad. I was just muted enough on Skippy Dies that I'm not super excited for a new book by Paul Murray, but I think a lot of people will probably be very happy by this news and intrigued by that plot. And that's okay. I just want to make sure you are all aware of it. Then there's Wellness by Nathan Hill. This is going to be released on September 19th. I actually DNF'd the Knicks. I was not a fan. But I know a lot of people loved that book a lot more than I did. And for that reason, again, I feel like people will be excited to know that he has a new book coming out. So here is information about it for those of you who are in that camp. When Jack and Elizabeth meet as college students in the 90s, the two quickly join forces and hold on tight, each eager to claim a place in Chicago's thriving underground art scene with an appreciative, kindred spirit. Fast forward 20 years to married life, and alongside the challenges of parenting, they encounter cults disguised as mindfulness support groups, polyamorous would-be suitors, Facebook wars, and something called Love Potion Number 9. For the first time, Jack and Elizabeth struggle to recognize each other, and the no longer youthful dreamers are forced to face their demons, from unfulfilled career ambitions to painful childhood memories of their own dysfunctional families. In the process, Jack and Elizabeth must undertake separate personal excavations or risk losing the best thing in their lives, each other. Again, I DNF'd the Knicks, so I don't feel any pull toward this novel myself, but I know a lot of people were fans, and I know a lot of people will find that premise interesting, so I just wanted to put that out there for you in case you are one of those people. Don't say I never did anything for you. The next one is on this list for a very specific reason. It's The Armor of Light by Ken Follett. The reason this is in this category, not for me, but notable for people who will be excited about this, is that I've never read The Pillars of the Earth, and there are a couple of books. Let's see. I have it noted somewhere. It's the third sequel to The Pillars of the Earth, which also has a prequel. So that's a lot of books in this series, but I haven't read any of them, and they're all really long. So if anything, I would read The Pillars of the Earth. And then there are a lot of steps that I would have to take in order to get to this book, because I would feel like I need to do it properly, read them in order. And that's a huge barrier for entry at this time. Maybe someday I'll get there, but definitely not right now. However, I know a lot of people have been following the Pillars of the Earth series, so here is information about this new book, which will be published on September 26th. The spinning jenny was invented in 1770, and with that, a new era of manufacturing and industry changed lives everywhere within a generation. A world filled with unrest wrestles for control over this new world order. A mother's husband is killed in a work accident due to negligence. A young woman fights to fund her school for impoverished children. A well-intentioned young man unexpectedly inherits a failing business. One man ruthlessly protects his wealth no matter the cost. All the while, war cries are heard from France. As Napoleon sets forth a violent master plan to become emperor of the world, as institutions are challenged and toppled in unprecedented fashion, ripples of change ricochet through our characters' lives as they are left to reckon with the future and a world they must rebuild from the ashes of war. Over 30 years ago, Ken Follett published his most popular novel, The Pillars of the Earth. Now, with this electrifying addition to the Kingsbridge series, we are plunged into the battlefield between compassion and greed, love and hate, progress and tradition. It is through each character that we are given a new perspective to the seismic shifts that shook the world in 19th century Europe. And again, I know a lot of people are big fans of this series. There are just so many steps that I would need to take to get to this book that it's not going to happen anytime soon, if at all. So, those are the books I'm a little unsure about. If you have feedback or recommendations or thoughts about any of them, I welcome you to leave them in the comment section down below. As always, I really appreciate your time, and I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.